Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to The Well-Told Tale. Every week we bring you the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. Today we return for the finale of The Sandman by ETA Hoffman. Last time we heard of the horrific backstory of Nathaniel, our main protagonist. His father died tragically in an explosion connected to Coppelius, a man Nathaniel has connected in his mind to the mythical, chilling Sandman, and a man he now sees in Coppola, an Italian trader in his university town. It is sending him deranged with fear and anger. A visit home to see his love Clara and her brother Lothaire seems to have brought Nathaniel back to his senses, but now he has returned to his university town. What will happen there? Is this all in Nathaniel's mind, or is Coppelius, the Sandman, real and maliciously twisting his mind? You can decide for yourself. As before, this dark fairy tale may not be suitable for younger children. It's time to pull up a chair, relax, and enjoy the finale of The Sandman by ETA Hoffman. When Nathaniel returned to his house, he was greatly astonished to find it burned to the ground, so that nothing but the bare outer walls were left standing amid a heap of ruins. Although the fire had broken out in the laboratory of the chemist who lived on the ground floor and had therefore spread upwards, some of Nathaniel's bold, active friends had succeeded in time in forcing a way into his room in the upper story and saving his books and manuscripts and instruments. They had carried them all uninjured to another house where they engaged a room for him. This he now at once took possession of. That he lived opposite Professor Spallanzani did not strike him particularly, nor did it occur to him as anything more singular that he could, as he observed by looking out of his window, see straight into the room where Olympia often sat alone. Her figure he could plainly distinguish, although her features were uncertain and confused. It did at length occur to him, however, that she remained for hours together in the same position in which he had first discovered her through the glass door, sitting at a little table without any occupation whatever, and it was evident that she was constantly gazing across in his direction. He could not but confess to himself that he had never seen a finer figure. However, with Clara, mistress of his heart, he remained perfectly unaffected by Olympia's stiffness and apathy, and it was only occasionally that he sent a fugitive glance over his compendium across to her. That was all. He was writing to Clara. A light tap came at the door. At his summons to "Come in," Coppola's repulsive face appeared peeping in. Nathaniel felt his heart beat with trepidation, but recollecting what Spallanzani had told him about his fellow countryman Coppola, and what he himself had so faithfully promised his beloved in respect to the Sandman Coppelius, he was ashamed at himself for this childish fear of spectres. Accordingly, he controlled himself with an effort, and said, as quietly and as calmly as he possibly could, "I do not want to buy any weather glasses, my good friend. You had better go elsewhere." Then Coppola came right into the room and said in a hoarse voice, screwing up his wide mouth into a hideous smile, while his little eyes flashed keenly from beneath his long grey eyelashes, "Eh? No want weather glass? No weather glass? I got eyes too, fine eyes." In some fright, Nathaniel cried, "You idiot! How can you have eyes? Eyes! Eyes!" But Coppola, laying aside his barometers, thrust his hands into his big coat pockets and brought out several spyglasses and spectacles and put them on the table. Look! Spectacles for nose, spectacles! Those, my eyes." And he continued to produce more and more spectacles from his pockets, until the table began to gleam and flash all over. Thousands of eyes were looking and blinking convulsively and staring up at Nathaniel. He could not avert his gaze from the table. Coppola went on heaping up his spectacles, while wilder and ever wilder burning flashes crossed through and through each other and darted their blood-red rays into Nathaniel's breast. Quite overcome and frantic with fear, he shouted, "Stop! Stop, you fiend!" And he seized Coppola by the arm, which Coppola had again thrust into his pocket in order to bring out still more spectacles, although the whole table was covered all over with them. With a harsh, disagreeable laugh, Coppola gently freed himself, and with the words, "So, want none? Well, here, fine glass," he swept all his spectacles together and put them back into his coat pockets, while from a breast pocket he produced a great number of larger and smaller perspectives. As soon as the spectacles were gone, Nathaniel recovered his equanimity again, and bending his thoughts upon Clara, he clearly discerned that the gruesome incubus had proceeded only from himself, and that Coppola was an honest mechanician and optician, and far from being Coppelius's dreaded double and ghost. And then, besides, none of the glasses which Coppola now placed on the table had anything at all singular about them, at least nothing so weird as the spectacles. So, in order to square accounts with himself, Nathaniel now really determined to buy something of the man. He took up a small, very beautifully cut pocket perspective, and by way of proving it, looked through the window. Never before in his life had he had a glass in his hands that brought out things so clearly and sharply and distinctly. Involuntarily he directed the glass upon Spallanzani's room. Olympia sat at the little table as usual, her arms laid upon it and her hands folded. Now he saw for the first time the regular and exquisite beauty of her features. The eyes, however, seemed to him to have a singular look of fixity and lifelessness. But as he continued to look closer and more carefully through the glass, he fancied a light like humid moonbeams came into them. It seemed as if their power of vision was now being enkindled. Their glances shone with ever-increasing vivacity. Nathaniel remained standing at the window as if glued to the spot by a wizard's spell, his gaze riveted unchangeably upon the divinely beautiful Olympia. A coughing and shuffling of the feet awakened him out of his enchaining dream, as it were. Coppola stood behind me. 3 zucchini, 3 ducats. Nathaniel had completely forgotten the optician. He hastily paid the sum demanded. "Ain't it fine glass, fine glass?" asked Coppola in his harsh, unpleasant voice, smiling sardonically. Yes, rejoined Nathaniel impatiently. "Adieu, my good friend." But Coppola did not leave the room without casting many peculiar side glances upon Nathaniel, and the young student heard him laughing loudly on the stairs. "Ah, well," he thought, "he's laughing at me because I've paid him too much for this little perspective, because I've given him too much money. That's it." As he softly murmured these words, he fancied he detected a gasping sigh as of a dying man stealing awfully through the room. His heart stopped beating with fear. But to be sure, he had heaved a deep sigh himself. It was quite plain. "Clara is quite right," he said to himself, "in holding me to be an incurable ghost-seer, and yet it's very ridiculous, more ridiculous, that the stupid thought of having paid Coppola too much for his glass should cause me this strange anxiety. I can't see any reason for it." Now he sat to finish his letter to Clara, but a glance through the window showed him Olympia still in her former posture. Urged by an irresistible impulse, he jumped up and seized Coppola's perspective, nor could he tear himself away from the fascinating Olympia until his friend Siegmund called for him to go to Professor Spallanzani's lecture. The curtains before the door of the all-important room were closely drawn, so he could not see Olympia, nor could he even see her from his own room during the 2 following days, notwithstanding that he scarcely ever left his room, and maintained a scarce interrupted watch through Coppola's perspective upon her room. On the 3rd day, curtains were drawn across the window, Plunged into the depths of despair, goaded by longing and ardent desire, he hurried outside the walls of the town. Olympia's image hovered about his path in the air and stepped forth out of the bushes and peeped up at him with large and lustrous eyes from the bright surface of the brook. Clara's image was completely faded from his mind. He had no thoughts except for Olympia. He uttered his love plaints loud and in a sad tone. "Oh, my glorious, noble star of love, have you only risen to vanish again, and leave me in the darkness and hopelessness of night?" Returning home, he became aware that there was a good deal of noisy bustle going on in Spallanzani's house. All the doors stood wide open. Men were taking in all kinds of gear and furniture. The windows of the first floor were all lifted off their hinges. Busy maidservants with immense hair brooms were driving backwards and forwards, dusting and sweeping, while from the inside could be heard the knocking and hammering of carpenters and upholsterers. Utterly astonished, Nathaniel stood still in the street. Then Siegmund joined him, laughing, and said, "Well, what do you say to our old Spallanzani?" Nathaniel assured him that he could not say anything, since he did not know what it all meant. To his great astonishment, he could hear, however, that they were turning the quiet, gloomy house almost inside out with their dusting and cleaning and alterations. Then he learned from Siegmund that Spallanzani intended giving the great concert and ball on the following day, and that half the university was invited. It was generally reported that Spallanzani was going to let his daughter Olympia, whom he had so long so jealously guarded from every eye, make her first appearance. Nathaniel received an invitation. At the appointed hour, when the carriages were rolling up and the lights were gleaming brightly in the decorated halls, he went across to the professor's, his heart beating high with expectation. The company was both numerous and brilliant. Olympia was richly and tastefully dressed. One could not but admire her figure and the regular beauty of her features, yet the striking inward curve of her back, as well as the wasp-like smallness of her waist, appeared to be the result of too tight lacing, and there was something stiff and measured in her gait and bearing that made an unfavourable impression upon many. It was ascribed to the constraint imposed upon her by the company. The concert began. Olympia played on the piano with great skill, and sang as skilfully an aria di bravura in a voice which was, if anything, almost too brilliant, but clear as glass bells. Nathaniel was transported with delight. He stood in the background furthest from her, and, owing to the blinding lights, could not quite distinguish her features. So, without being observed, he took Coppola's glass out of his pocket and directed it upon the beautiful Olympia. Oh, then he perceived how her yearning eyes sought him, how every note only reached its full purity in the loving glance which penetrated to and inflamed his heart. Her roulades seemed to him to be the exultant cry towards heaven of the soul refined by love, and when at last, after the cadenza, the long trill rang loudly through the hall, he felt as if he were suddenly grasped by burning arms and could no longer control himself. He could not help shouting aloud in his mingled pain and delight, "Olympia!" All eyes were turned upon him. Many people laughed. The concert came to an end, and the ball began. Oh, to dance with her! With her! That was now the aim of all Nathaniel's wishes, of all his desires. But how should he have courage to request her, the queen of the ball, to grant him the honour of a dance? And yet he couldn't tell how it came about. Just as the dance began, he found himself standing close beside her, nobody having as yet asked her to be his partner. So, with some difficulty, stammering out a few words, he grasped her hand. It was cold as ice. He shook with an awful frosty shiver, but fixing his eyes upon her face, he saw that her glance was beaming upon him with Jove and longing, and at the same moment he thought that the pulse began to beat in her cold hand, and the warm lifeblood to course through her veins, and passion burned more intensely in his own heart also. He threw his arm around her beautiful waist and whirled her around the hall. He had always thought that he kept good and accurate time in dancing, but from the perfectly rhythmical evenness with which Olympia danced, and which frequently put him quite out, he perceived how very faulty his own time really was. Notwithstanding, he would not dance with any other lady, and everybody else who approached Olympia to call upon her for a dance he would have liked to kill on the spot. This, however, only happened twice. To his astonishment, Olympia remained after this without a partner, and he did not fail on each occasion to take her out again. If Nathaniel had been able to see anything else except the beautiful Olympia, there would inevitably have been a good deal of unpleasant quarrelling and strife. For it was evident that Olympia was the object of the smothered laughter, suppressed only with difficulty, which was heard in various corners amongst the young people, and they followed her with very curious looks. Nathaniel, excited by dancing and the plentiful supply of wine he had consumed, had laid aside the shyness which at other times characterized him. He sat beside Olympia, her hand in his own, and declared his love enthusiastically and passionately, in words which neither of them understood, neither he nor Olympia. And yet, perhaps she did, for she sat with her eyes fixed unchangeably upon his, sighing repeatedly, "Ah, ah, ah." Upon this, Nathaniel would answer, "Oh, you glorious, heavenly lady! You ray from the promised paradise of love. Oh, what a profound soul you have. My whole being is mirrored in it," and a good deal more in the same strain. But Olympia only continued to sigh, "Ah, ah," again and again. Professor Spallanzani passed by the two happy lovers once or twice, and smiled with a look of peculiar satisfaction. All at once, it seemed to Nathaniel, albeit he was far away in a different world, as if it were growing perceptibly darker down below at Professor Spallanzani's. He looked about him, and to his very great alarm, became aware that there were only 2 lights left burning in the hall, and they were on the point of going out. The music and dancing had long ago ceased. "We must part," he cried, wildly and despairingly. He kissed Olympia's hand, he bent down to her mouth, but ice-cold lips met his burning ones. As he touched her cold hand, he felt his heart thrill with awe. The legend of the dead bride shot suddenly through his mind, but Olympia had drawn him closer to her, and the kiss appeared to warm her lips into vitality. Professor Spallanzani strode slowly through the empty apartment, his footsteps giving a hollow echo, and his figure had, as the flickering shadows played about him, a ghostly, awful appearance. "Do you love me? Do you love me, Olympia? Only one little word. Do you love me?" whispered Nathaniel, but she only sighed, "Ah," as she rose to her feet. "Yes, you are my lovely, glorious star of love," said Nathaniel, "and will shine forever, purifying and ennobling my heart." "Ah, ah," replied Olympia as she moved along. Nathaniel followed her. They stood before the professor. "You have had an extraordinarily animated conversation with my daughter," he said, smiling. "Well, well, my dear Nathaniel, if you find pleasure in talking to the stupid girl, I am sure I shall be glad for you to come and do so." Nathaniel took his leave, his heart singing and leaping in a perfect delirium of happiness. During the next few days, Spallanzani's ball was the general topic of conversation. Although the professor had done everything to make the thing a splendid success, yet certain gay spirits related more than one thing that had occurred which was quite irregular and out of order. They were especially keen in pulling Olympia to pieces for her taciturnity and rigid stiffness. In spite of her beautiful form, they alleged that she was hopelessly stupid, and in this fact they discerned the reason why Spallanzani had so long kept her concealed from publicity. Nathaniel heard all this with inward wrath, but nevertheless he held his tongue, for, thought he, would it indeed be worthwhile to prove to these fellows that it is their own stupidity which prevents them from appreciating Olympia's profound and brilliant parts? One day Siegmund said to him, "Pray, brother, have the kindness to tell me how you, a clever fellow, came to lose your head over that Miss Wax-Face, that wooden doll across there." Nathaniel was about to fly into a rage, but he recollected himself and replied, "Tell me, Siegmund, how come it that Olympia's divine charms could escape your eyes, so keenly alive as it is always to beauty, and your acute perception as well? But heaven be thanked for it, otherwise I should have you for a rival, and then the blood of one of us would have had to be spilled." Siegmund, perceiving how matters stood with his friend, skilfully changed his tactics, and said, after remarking that all argument with one in love about the object of his affections was out of place, "Yet it's very strange that several of us have formed pretty much the same opinion about Olympia. We think she is— you won't take it ill, brother? That she is singularly statuesque and soulless. Her figure is regular, and so are her features, that can't be gainsaid, and if her eyes were not so utterly devoid of life, I may say, of the power of vision, she might pass for a beauty. She is strangely measured in her movements. They all seem as if they were dependent upon some wound-up clockwork. Her playing and singing have the disagreeably perfect but insensitive timing of a singing machine, and her dancing is the same. We felt quite afraid of this Olympia, and did not like to have anything to do with her. She seemed to us to be only acting like a living creature, and as if there was some secret at the bottom of it all." Nathaniel did not give way to the bitter feelings which threatened to master him at these words. He fought down and got the better of his displeasure, and merely said very earnestly, "You cold, prosaic fellows may very well be afraid of her. It is only to its like that the poetically organised spirit unfolds itself. Upon me alone did her loving glances fall, and through my mind and thoughts alone did they radiate, and only in her love can I find my own self again. Perhaps, however, she doesn't do quite right not to jabber a lot of nonsense and stupid talk like other shallow people. It is true she speaks but few words, but the few words she does speak are genuine hieroglyphs of the inner world of love, and of the higher cognition of the intellectual life revealed in the intuition of the eternal beyond the grave. But you have no understanding for all these things. I am only wasting words." "God be with you, brother," said Siegmund, very gently, almost sadly, "but it seems to me that you are in a very bad way. You may rely upon me if all— no, I can't say any more." It all at once dawned upon Nathaniel that his cold, prosaic friend Siegmund really and sincerely wished him well, and so he warmly shook his proffered hand. Nathaniel had completely forgotten that there was a Clara in the world, whom he had once loved, and his mother and Lothaire. They had all vanished from his mind. He lived for Olympia alone. He sat beside her every day for hours altogether, rhapsodizing about his love and sympathy enkindled into life, and about psychic elective affinity, all of which Olympia listened to with great reverence. He fished up from the very bottom of his desk all the things he had ever written, poems, fancy sketches, visions, romances, tales, and the heap was increased daily with all kinds of aimless sonnets, stanzas, canzonets. All these he read to Olympia hour after hour without growing tired, but then he had never had such an exemplary listener. She neither embroidered nor knitted. She did not look out of the window, or feed a bird, or play with a little pet dog or a favourite cat. Neither did she twist a piece of paper or anything of that kind round her finger. She did not forcibly convert a yawn into a low, affected cough. In short, She sat hour after hour with her eyes bent unchangeably upon her lover's face, without moving or altering her position, and her gaze grew more ardent and more ardent still. And it was only when at last Nathaniel rose and kissed her lips or her hand that she said, "Ah, ah," and then, "Good night, dear." Back in his own room, Nathaniel would break out with, "Oh, what a brilliant, what a profound mind! Only you alone understand me." And his heart trembled with rapture when he reflected upon the wondrous harmony which daily revealed itself between his own and Olympia's character, for he fancied that she had expressed in respect to his works and his poetic genius the identical sentiments which he himself cherished deep down in his own heart, and even as if it were his own heart's voice speaking to him. And it must indeed have been so, for Olympia never uttered any other words than those already mentioned. When Nathaniel himself, in his clear and sober moments, as, for instance, directly after waking in a morning, thought about her utter passivity and taciturnity, he only said, "What are words but words?" The glance of her heavenly eyes says more than any tongue, and anyway, how can a child of heaven accustom herself to the narrow circle which the exigencies of a wretched mundane life demand? Professor Spallanzani appeared to be greatly pleased at the intimacy that had sprung up between his daughter Olympia and Nathaniel, and showed the young man many unmistakable proofs of his good feeling towards him. When Nathaniel ventured at length to hint, very delicately, at an alliance with Olympia, the professor smiled all over his face at once, and said he should allow his daughter to make a perfectly free choice. Encouraged by those words, and with the fire of desire burning in his heart, Nathaniel resolved the very next day to implore Olympia to tell him frankly, in plain words, what he had long read in her sweet, loving glances, that she would be his forever. He looked for the ring which his mother had given him at parting. He would present it to Olympia as a symbol of his devotion, and of the happy life he was to lead with her from that time onward. While looking for it, he came across his letters from Clara and Lothaire. He threw them carelessly aside, found the ring, put it in his pocket, and ran across to Olympia. While still on the stairs in the entrance passage, he heard an extraordinary hubbub. The noise seemed to proceed from Spallanzani's study. There was a stamping, a rattling, pushing, knocking against the door, with curses and oaths intermingled. Leave hold, you monster, you rascal! Put your life's work into it! Ha! Ha! That was not our wager. I made the eyes. I the clockwork. Go to the devil with your clockwork, you damned dog of a watchmaker. Be off, Satan. Stop, you paltry turner, you infernal beast. Stop. Be gone. Let me go. The voices which were thus making all this racket and rumpus were those of Spallanzani and the fearsome Coppelius. Nathaniel rushed in, impelled by some nameless dread. The professor was grasping a female figure by the shoulders. The Italian Coppola held her by the feet, and they were pulling and dragging each other backwards and forwards, fighting furiously to get possession of her. Nathaniel recoiled with horror on recognizing that the figure was Olympia. Boiling with rage, he was about to tear his beloved from the grasp of the madmen when Coppola, by an extraordinary exertion of strength, twisted the figure out of the professor's hands and gave him such a terrible blow with her that Spallanzani reeled backwards and fell over the table among the phials and retorts, the bottles and glass cylinders which covered it. All these things were smashed into 1,000 pieces. But Coppola threw the figure across his shoulder and, laughing shrilly and horribly, ran hastily down the stairs, the figure's ugly feet hanging down and banging and rattling like wood against the steps. Nathaniel was stupefied. He had seen only too distinctly that in Olympia's pallid, waxed face there were no eyes, merely black holes in their stead. She was an inanimate puppet. Spallanzani was rolling on the floor. The pieces of glass had cut his head and breast and arm. The blood was escaping from him in streams, but he gathered his strength together by an effort. After him! After him! What do you stand there staring for? Coppelius! Coppelius! He's stolen my best automaton, at which I've worked for 20 years, my life work, the clockwork, speech, movement, mine, your eyes! Stolen your eyes, damn him! Curse him! After him! Fetch me back Olympia! There are the eyes! And now Nathaniel saw a pair of bloody eyes lying on the floor, staring at him. Spallanzani seized them with his uninjured hand and threw them at him, so that they hit his breast. Then madness dug her burning talons into Nathaniel and swept down into his heart, rending his mind and thoughts to shreds. Aha! 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 Fire wheel! Fire wheel! Spin round, fire wheel, merrily, merrily, aha! Wooden doll, spin round, pretty wooden doll. And he threw himself upon the professor, clutching him fast by the throat. He would certainly have strangled him had not several people, attracted by the noise, rushed in and torn away the madman, and so they saved the professor, whose wounds were immediately dressed. Siegmund, with all his strength, was not able to subdue the frantic lunatic, who continued to scream in a dreadful way, "Spin round, wooden doll!" and to strike out right and left with his doubled fists. At length, the uniting strength of several succeeded in overpowering him by throwing him on the floor and binding him. His cries passed into a brutish bellow that was awful to hear, and thus, raging with the harrowing violence of madness, he was taken away to the madhouse. Before continuing my narration of what happened further to the unfortunate Nathaniel, I will tell you, indulgent reader, in case you take any interest in that skilful mechanician and fabricator of automata, Spallanzani, that he recovered completely from his wounds. He had, however, to leave the university, for Nathaniel's fate had created a great sensation, and the opinion was pretty generally expressed that it was an imposture altogether unpardonable to have smuggled a wooden puppet instead of a living person into intelligent tea circles, for Olympia had been present at several with success. Lawyers called it a cunning piece of knavery, and all the harder to punish since it was directed against the public, and it had been so craftily contrived that it had escaped unobserved by all, except a few preternaturally acute students, although everybody was very wise now, and remembered to have thought of several facts which occurred to them as suspicious, but these latter could not succeed in making out any sort of a consistent tale. For was it, for instance, a thing likely to occur to anyone as suspicious that, according to the declaration of an elegant beau of these tea parties, Olympia had, contrary to all good manners, sneezed oftener than she had yawned? The former must have been, in the opinion of this elegant gentleman, the winding up of the concealed clockwork. It had always been accompanied by an observable creaking, and so on. The professor of poetry and eloquence took a pinch of snuff, and slapping the lid to and clearing his throat, said solemnly, "My most honourable ladies and gentlemen, don't you see then where the rub is? The whole thing is an allegory, a continuous metaphor. You understand me? Sapienti sat." But several most honourable gentlemen did not rest satisfied with this explanation. The history of this automaton had sunk deeply into their souls, and an absurd mistrust of human figures began to prevail. Several lovers, in order to be fully convinced that they were not paying court to a wooden puppet, required that their mistress should sing and dance a little out of time, should embroider or knit, or play with her little pug, and so on, when being read to, but above all things else, that she should do something more than merely listen, that she should frequently speak in such a way as to really show that her words presupposed as a condition some thinking and feeling. The bonds of love were in many cases drawn closer in consequence, and so, of course, became more engaging. In other instances they gradually relaxed and fell away. "I cannot really be made responsible for it," was the remark of more than one young gallant. At the tea-gatherings, everybody, in order to ward off suspicion, yawned to an incredible extent, and never sneezed. Spallanzani was obliged, as has been said, to leave the place, in order to escape a criminal charge of having fraudulently imposed an automaton upon human society. Coppola, too, had also disappeared. When Nathaniel awoke, he felt as if he had been oppressed by a terrible nightmare. He opened his eyes and experienced an indescribable sensation of mental comfort, while a soft and most beautiful sensation of warmth pervaded his body. He lay on his own bed in his own room at home. Clara was bending over him, and at a little distance stood his mother and Lothaire. At last, oh my darling Nathaniel, now we have you again. Now you are cured of your grievous illness. Now you are mine again." And Clara's words came from the depths of her heart, and she clasped him in her arms. The bright, scalding tears streamed from his eyes. He was so overcome with mingled feelings of sorrow and delight, and he gasped forth, "My Clara, my Clara!" Siegmund, who had staunchly stood by his friend in his hour of need, now came into the room. Nathaniel gave him his hand. "My faithful brother, you have not deserted me." Every trace of insanity had left him, and in the tender hands of his mother and his beloved and his friends, he quickly recovered his strength again. Good fortune had in the meantime visited the house. A niggardly old uncle, from whom they had never expected to get anything, had died, and left Nathaniel's mother not only a considerable fortune, but also a small estate, pleasantly situated not far from the town. There they resolved to go and live. Nathaniel and his mother, and Clara, to whom he was now to be married, and Lothaire. Nathaniel had become gentler and more childlike than he had ever been before, and now began really to understand Clara's supremely pure and noble character. None of them ever reminded him, even by the remotest degree, of the past. But when Siegmund took leave of him, Nathaniel said, "By heaven, brother, I was in a bad way, but an angel came just at the right moment and led me back upon the path of light. Yes, it was Clara." Siegmund would not let him speak further, fearing lest the painful recollections of the past might arise too vividly and too intensely in his mind. The time came for the four happy people to move to their little property. At noon they were going through the streets. After making several purchases, they found that the lofty tower of the town hall was throwing its giant shadows across the marketplace. "Come," said Clara, "let us go up to the top once more and have a look at the distant hills." No sooner said than done. Both of them, Nathaniel and Clara, went up the tower. Their mother, however, went on with the servant girl to her new home, and Lothaire, not feeling inclined to climb up so many stairs, waited below. There the two lovers stood arm in arm on the topmost gallery of the tower and gazed out into the sweet-scented wooded landscape, beyond which the blue hills rose up like a giant city. "Oh, do look at that strange little grey bush. It looks as if it were actually walking towards us," said Clara. Mechanically he put his hand into his side pocket. He found Coppola's perspective and looked for the bush. Clara stood in front of the glass. Then a convulsive thrill shot through his pulse and veins. Pale as a corpse, he fixed his staring eyes upon her, but soon they began to roll, and a fiery current flashed and sparkled in them, and he yelled fearfully like a hunted animal. Leaping up high in the air and laughing horribly at the same time, he began to shout in a piercing voice, "Spin round, wooden doll! Spin round, wooden doll!" With the strength of a giant, he laid hold upon Clara and tried to hurl her over, but in an agony of despair, she clutched fast hold of the railing that went around the gallery. Lothaire heard the madman raging, and Clara's scream of terror. A fearful presentiment flashed across his mind. He ran up the stairs. The door of the second flight was locked. Clara's scream for help rang out more loudly. Mad with rage and fear, he threw himself against the door, which at length gave way. Clara's cries were growing fainter and fainter. "Help! Save me! Save me!" And her voice died away in the air. "She is killed! Murdered by that madman!" shouted Lothaire. The door to the gallery was also locked. Despair gave him the strength of a giant. He burst the door off its hinges. Good God! There was Clara in the grasp of the madman Nathaniel, hanging over the gallery in the air, holding on to the iron bar with only one hand. Quick as lightning, Lothaire seized his sister and pulled her back, at the same time dealing the madman a blow in the face with his doubled fist, which sent him reeling backwards, forcing him to let go of his victim. Lothaire ran down with his insensible sister in his arms. She was saved. But Nathaniel ran round and round the gallery, leaping up in the air and shouting, "Spin round, firewheel! Spin round, firewheel!" The people heard the wild shouting, and a crowd began to gather. In the midst of them towered the lawyer Coppelius, like a giant. He had only just arrived in the town and had gone straight to the marketplace. Some were for going up to overpower and take the madman, but Coppelius laughed and said, "Ha, ha, wait a bit. He'll come down of his own accord." And he stood gazing up along with the rest. All at once, Nathaniel stopped as if spellbound. He bent down over the railing and perceived Coppelius. With a piercing scream, "Hey, fine eyes! Fine eyes!" he leapt over the railing. When Nathaniel lay on the stone pavement with a shattered head, Coppelius had disappeared in the crush and confusion. Several years afterwards, it was reported that outside the door of a pretty country house in a remote district, Clara had been seen sitting hand in hand with a pleasant gentleman, while two bright boys were playing at her feet. From this, it may be concluded that she eventually found that quiet domestic happiness which her cheerful, blithesome character required, and which Nathaniel, with his tempest-tossed soul, could never have been able to give her. And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the finale of The Sandman by ETA Hoffman. If you did, then please consider supporting The Well-Told Tale on Patreon at patreon.com/thewelltoldtale. There's a link in the description. I'll be back next week with another classic story. I hope you can join me.